First of all, thanks everybody for showing up, especially right after lunch. I always like to ask this. How many of you are at your first BriForum? A few of you, okay. What do you think? You like it so far? So my name's Ian Parker. I'm a senior web services architect at Thomson Reuters, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the new Xperf. And the key word might be new. Xperf is not new. It's been around for a long time. And perhaps more importantly, the underlying architecture upon which it reads its information and gathers its information has been around longer than I think most of us have realized. But they've made some rather significant changes, and kind of the genesis of this was kind of the new tool comes as part of the Windows 8 ADK or SDK, and I think a lot of us just kind of assumed that's Windows 8, maybe this is a Metro Modern kind of thing, and it wasn't really available to us. But it does have down-level capabilities, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. They play some interesting games with Xperf in terms of what is supported at Microsoft. For a long time, the standard spiel was that you had to be Vista 2008 later. People played around and found out that you could put those a couple of DLLs on an XP machine. You could collect data just fine. You might not necessarily get all of the data or functionality you'd get on something later, because as we'll talk a little bit about this is really a front end to the instrumentation that Microsoft has been slowly and steadily building into the kernel and into the OS itself. So depending on your needs, take those system requirements with a little bit of grain of salt. And if you play around, you may find you can actually do some more things than are strictly supported or even suggested or possible by Microsoft. So I'm kind of the performance guy at my company, which is kind of a bad thing, right? If you have a performance guy at your company, that probably means there's a problem or you have a history of problems. So that's sometimes not the best title to have, but that's where we ended up. Explain a little bit about what I do. We are kind of an old school application service provider environment. We have a big XenApp farm. We have a bunch of customers. We sell our software both to people to install locally or if they want us to host it. And as part of the hosting solution over time, we've grown. It's not particularly big. We have about 50 published apps, Microsoft Office, that kind of thing. But our sales guys like to sell with the idea of it will never run any faster than it runs on our hardware. We don't really like those claims. Now, depending on your environment, that's entirely possible, right? But if you're sitting there with a screaming machine with SSD and everything else and no other load on your machine, that can be pretty hard to match in an SBC environment. But that's kind of where the analysis part came on our end, because we had some issues with customers who would come off their local systems, they would come onto our hosted systems, and they would grumble, and we would have to figure out what's fixable at what cost, what frankly isn't fixable, and we just have to kind of deal with and say, thank you very much, here's your refund, we keep hoping to use our software locally. We also are, because we're in the tax and accounting business, we turn over our apps pretty quickly. The tax application is essentially rewritten from ground up every year, and that's millions of lines of source code. So the performance of applications over time is highly variable, right? The first version of our tax app comes out in December. The best thing I can say about it is it doesn't do much of anything, so it's not really apparent that it's not very highly optimized. So if you can't do much, you don't notice it's pretty slow. And then obviously through the processes, things get better, hopefully. And one of the interesting things that always happens when you're hosting your own software with your own development team is they kind of view you as their development lab. We can put this code out there and see how it performs, and we're real close to these guys, right? We can pick them up. We don't have to actually call up a customer and ask a loaded question like, so we put out this update last week, and what did you think about that? So getting some metrics, getting some analysis of things became pretty important to our development process as well. So let's talk a little bit about Xperf. And I guess the first thing I should say is it isn't Xperf anymore. It's the Windows Performance Recorder and Analyzer, or at least that's the name of the GUI tools. The names of the executables and the DLLs essentially hasn't changed, but we have a slightly more friendly name for it, I guess you can call it. It is still free, and it is still annoying to obtain. There is no package where you can just go and download it and say, I would like WPR, or I'd like WPT. You go to the MSDN landing site for the page, and they tell you have to go get the ADK or the SDK. You got to run that thing, you got to go through the wizard, and then you can select the options you want. Because the package itself is pretty small. It's like 30 megabytes or something like that. But if you're not paying attention and you select all of a sudden you find yourself downloading the whole WinPE environment and a few other things like that, and you're looking at a 6 gig download. But it's out there, just run the installer. It's slightly easier to obtain than you might think at first. Again, they say now it is only down level to 2008 R2. It's kind of smart about that now. If you actually run the installer, because you have an option to either install the tools on the computer or just copy the files so they can be deployed somewhere else. Xperf has always been Xcopy deployable. So if you just want to get an MSI, or even once you do that MSI and install it, you can just pick up the directory and move it. But it's smart enough now that if you're on something like 2008 R1, it won't offer you the options for Xperf, which was really annoying because the first time I just happened to do it on a 2008 machine, and I'm looking at this going, where did it go? And I'm double checking the documentation. It's supposed to be there. These options just aren't there. So you will need to find a relatively new machine in order to extract these tools and move them around. Data collection is still supported. Depending on what you're doing, you can get by with as little as 2 DLLs that you can just Xcopy deploy to another machine and run it off a command line. Of course, you're not going to get the GUI and the rest of that sort of stuff, but you do have those options that are out there, and that's something I'm really kind of a fan of. We run in a Citrix provisioning server environment, so we don't worry too much about putting things on boxes because we're going to do a scheduled reboot every night and wipe that out. But I still don't like contaminating things, right? Particularly when you're dealing with performance. You kind of want to keep things as clean as possible. You start dumping all kinds of stuff everywhere on a system, and all of a sudden you're not necessarily sure, is the data and information you're gathering relevant to the state of the machine before or after you put all your performance stuff on it? So I do think that that's a good option, but you will have to deal with the command line, which is fine. A lot of us are fine with command lines. But as I'll talk a little bit later about this is not the best documented product in the world. Yes, Tim?
Do you know the difference between the ADK and the SDK version of the performance tools? Because I noticed the size of the installers are different.
So the question is do I know the difference between the ADK and the SDK installers because the size is different? No, I never noticed the size, but I have not seen any difference. I didn't go particularly looking for it. I presume maybe there's some additional debugging tools or something in there. But you know, folks, if Tim doesn't know, I'm probably not going to know either. Tim's actually used Xperf, I believe, in a lot of production scenarios, especially with his AppV debugging. And I think you talked about Xperf in your AppV debugging session yesterday. So if this is something that interests you in that context, I'd highly recommend. I mean, go listen to Tim's sessions anyway, but for that reason alone is another reason to go listen to it. So what is Xperf? Essentially what this is a tool that's a view into the event tracing for Windows subsystem, which has been around at least since Windows 2000, I think. It might have been back in NT4 for as far as I know. But ETW has been out there, and it was one of those things you could see about and you could read about, but unless you were a developer who was writing some kind of custom hooks into the system, you probably didn't know much about anything about it, and I certainly don't think there were a whole lot of tools that were available for system administrators as opposed to developers. So because it's part of event tracing for Windows, you're wired pretty deep into both user and kernel mode. That's where a lot of the power comes because you exist on both sides of that divide. ETW is completely woven into the OS at this point, and I think it's probably fair to say since at least Windows 2008 it's been that way. That instrumentation and event tracing processes are just part of the core OS as much as anything else, I think, in Windows. And they've essentially been exposing this to us over time. Microsoft has been pretty clear about the fact that they use this in their build processes. If you believe them, every time they check in a change to an OS build of any significance, they have to go through a benchmarking process with Xperf. And if they have made any performance changes, they have to qualify that, and it has to be essentially agreed upon about whether or not this is a worthwhile change for the overhead it introduces. As I mentioned before, it's very poorly documented. There is not much of the way of any documentation that comes with the product itself. Frankly, most of the best documentation that's out there are people who write blog posts who have kind of flailed around and figured out how to do their own stuff with it. The Premier Field Engineering team, the Ask PFE blog, I think, has a few interesting articles that are of some use. The NT Debugging group, I think, has a few things that are useful out there. But for a tool that is supposed to be so widely used at Microsoft, it's a little odd that it isn't documented better. The cynical part of me suggests that I hear that Microsoft Consulting uses it a lot in evaluating environments, and perhaps if it were better documented and better well known, it might compete with Microsoft Consulting. But that's just me being cynical. I mean, those Microsoft guys are real nice folks. They'd never do anything like that. Anything more than the Citrix Consulting guys would do that. We got anybody from Citrix in here? Anybody from CSC? Good, so I'm safe with that, right? So it is much easier to use with the new GUI for Windows 8 2012. This was essentially a command line tool, and again, as I said, that's fine, but you had to chain a fair number of arguments off of that. The syntax, at least to me, wasn't always obvious. So it's nice to be able to have a GUI, and from my particular biases, when you're doing some performance analysis, it's always nice if you don't have to stop and learn something when you're trying to get a tool and get some information out there. I've been stuck in plenty of situations where somebody needs to know what's going on right now. We need some ideas, at least some place to start and look at something. And that's not really the time you want to pull out a README or a manual or something like that and start figuring out, well, I need to do this and everything else. I mean, I suppose it's lazy of me, but when I'm in a hurry and it's important, give me check boxes and next, right? The faster I can get through this and get some data, the better it is. And maybe I don't get exactly what I need, but at least I can show my boss I'm doing something, and he'll stop hovering over my shoulder and annoying me and doing those sorts of things. It's also incredibly powerful. Whether you're talking the GUI or the command line, it does a lot, and we'll talk about that a little bit because that's kind of one of the problems with it. You can also write your own providers, and we'll talk about providers a little bit more later. But if you have the technical chops, you can go in and write your own profiles and kind of focus down on particular information you're after. Again, I think this is probably more useful from either a development standpoint or working with a development team if you're trying to get an application to run better in a multi-user environment. I wouldn't go hacking on this on your own. So what isn't it? It's certainly not the first performance tool I would use. There are a lot of performance tools out there. Some are free from Microsoft, some are free for vendors on limited trials. Good old Perfmon works fine. If you're having an issue, particularly if it's a critical issue, this is not the place I would start. Fire up Perfmon, use one of these other tools. I mean, Perfmon's pretty simple. You can go out and grab some statistics on CPU, network, disk, file I/O, that kind of thing, and get an idea, if you're actually on fire for some place for some reason. Xperf might be overkill for that. Now, if you already know where you are, it might be a good second or third choice to try and figure out, well, we know that we have huge network activity or huge disk activity, but for the life of us, nobody can figure out why. That's, I think, kind of the situation when you want to start looking at Xperf. It is not non-invasive. Because this has wormed its way so deep into the kernel, depending on the options you choose, depending on what you do, you're going to put a load on the system. It certainly collects huge data files. It attempts to be non-invasive by the way it uses event tracing for Windows. ETW uses a circular logging function. Is anybody familiar with this besides Tim? Right. So what it essentially does is it sets up a buffer, and it tries to hold all this information that it's gathering through the ETW infrastructure. And it only tries to flush that out to disk when it's needed or when the system is idle. Now, in a performance situation, that might be your problem, right? Your disk is never idle, or you're under so much stress that this can't be done. So it's entirely possible with anything that uses ETW, whether it's Xperf or anything else, that your buffer is going to drop events. I think the similar situation to this that most of us are familiar with is, how many of you have used Mark Rusinovich's sysinternals procmon utility? Okay, most of you. If you haven't, by the way, that's probably the single biggest thing you would take away from BriForum is go find procmon and get familiar with it. But if you run that over a heavily loaded system, you can watch events get dropped because procmon is actually hooking in and grabbing ETW information itself. And on a highly busy system, it just may not have the ability to take that and keep all that data, so you may find things that are dropped. I've run into that situation before, and actually we had a junior admin who put procmon on a loaded production system to try and get an idea of what was going on, and I'm still not sure how he did this, but he blue screened the box. And the best thing I can say about that is he was smart enough to own up to it, and it was fine. We had a little talk, and we moved on. As the joke was, well, nobody on that box was doing anything because it was buried anyway, so how bad was it that they got knocked off? It is not particularly user-friendly, even with the new GUI, which we'll take a look at later. So if it seems like a raw, unpolished, strange product to you, I think that should be your expectation in many ways. And again, I just find this so odd, given this is supposedly such a highly used tool inside Microsoft. It almost makes you wonder if they're not consciously doing something here, because there just doesn't seem to be a good reason if so many people are using it. It is not a best practice tool. It is not going to give you very many recommendations at all. Other tools, things from Microsoft like the Performance Analysis of Logs tool, or even other performance tools will say things like, hey, your disk looks slow, or you've run out of memory, or you've done something like this. This will offer you no friendly help for the most part. The best it does will occasionally say things like, there appears to be a delay here. Go look at what that is. Won't tell you what or why. You have to bring some knowledge to it, and that can get interesting. So this kind of feeds into what I'm talking about with Beware. We get into these conversations a little bit at work where you get a lot of data and you look at this and people start making judgments about things like, that thing made 10,000 registry calls in 5 minutes. It shouldn't be doing that. If you're not the developer and you're not deep into Windows architecture internals, I think it's dangerous to make those sort of assumptions. There might be a very good reason why that app is doing that. And when you just get data without any guidance or anything else, I think it can send you down the wrong path. We've certainly run into that situation a couple of times where we've said, there's absolutely no way this thing should be hitting this file over the network as frequently as it does. And 2 weeks later, we get into a discussion, the developer goes, no, I wrote it to do that, to address this particular reason. And so, we're running around telling people we've got a problem with the app, and the developer is sitting over there throwing rocks at us going, would you guys shut up? You don't know anything about the architecture. So be careful with any assumptions. For most accurate data, Xperf requires disabling paging of the kernel. Does anybody remember those old methodology in a box articles that used to be out there for how to build your Citrix servers? It used to be a whole list of registry keys and optimizations, and you changed this option here and you did this. For a long time, one of those was disabling the paging of the executive, of the kernel. I was never really fond of that particular tweak, particularly once we got past about Windows 2003. I mean, if you were in an old environment, where 32 megs of RAM or something like that back in NT4 seemed like a big deal, that was probably an interesting tweak. Once we got to 2003 and we got gigabytes worth of memory, I think that option probably doesn't do a whole lot. Your mileage may vary depending on where you are. Certainly now, I don't know that it does much. And the kernel's pretty large these days compared to what it was back then, so there may be very, very good reasons to page the kernel out. I will say this. The GUI pops up something that says, hey, if we want to do this action, we have to do this. I'll set the registry key and you got to reboot and we'll do it. And it does pop up a reminder that says, hey, we've done this. There may be a performance impact on this. Undo it when we're done. I don't know enough about kernel mode development to know if that's true or not. I'm sure it may vary in your environment, but I think I would just follow what it says, right? If you're setting that key, unset it later. And if you're already set that way in your production environment, great. I'd love to talk to you if you have any metrics or ideas on what that has done for you, in the recent past as opposed to, a long time ago. I'd really like to, to see what you can do or what you could gain by that option. It generates possibly enormous log files, and I'm not kidding. We're talking gigabytes here. So be careful. I won't say who, but maybe one person in my company once let some performance traces run a long time and filled up the disk on the box, which wasn't a good choice. He's fortunately still employed and still speaking at BriForum, but be careful. You don't want to, on a production system especially, you cause yourself other problems by your performance monitoring tools. It certainly can be intrusive on both the data collection phase and on the analysis phase. Anytime you're working with gigabytes of data, you're going to stress the system, right? So I would highly advise you, under almost any circumstances, take those log files, move them to a machine out of production, and analyze them there. Again, this always falls back on the idea of you don't want to make your problem any worse while you're trying to fix it. Occasionally, I mentioned this earlier in the week, sometimes you got to do what you got to do, right? Sometimes it takes too long to move these things around. And if you have to do it, okay, but be aware of what you're doing. And we'll talk about this a little bit later when we get in the GUI, but you do have options to keep log files in memory because of the circular logging function. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense to go analyzing a disk I/O problem if you're writing gigabytes of log files to the disk while you're trying to find out what's going on the disk. You pretty much obscured what's going on, right? So again, you got to stop to think a little bit about what you're doing. It can certainly be misleading, and this feeds back into what I was talking about earlier. You're given a lot of information here, and it's hard to put in context. So in many ways, although Xperf is not what I would call a benchmarking tool at all, it might be really useful if this is a tool that you think you're going to use to run it on some systems that are fine, Park those log files somewhere, keep them for reference, browse through them. They may not mean a whole lot to you. But then when you go and you do have a problem and you're pulling some log files and you make this assumption like, why is this file being accessed 10,000 times or something like that? If it's always been that way, then whatever the problem is probably not that, because it was that way before. Your mileage may vary, but we have a lot of these discussions. To give you an example, we went back and forth for months on my team about memory and sizing on terminal servers in Citrix, right? What was the classic mode of sizing your terminal servers, right? People would tell you log on, load the apps, go into Task Manager, look at the working set, go, aha, that's X number of megabytes, multiply that by some number of users, and you think you have, the number of people that your box can support. Everybody's probably heard of that sizing methodology, right? No? Okay, a few of you. I think Brian actually wrote an article about it years ago saying that that's how he would size his terminal servers. The problem with this comes, and you can ask Mr. Tim Mangan over there if you don't believe me, as Windows has evolved, it's made a lot more use of cache. And Tim did a great presentation, was it last year, Tim, on cache? Mm-hmm. So Windows itself now is using a lot more memory, and that methodology where you take one guy and you log in and you look at the system, you're probably going to get some misleading results about that. And we went back and forth with our company about that, and you start digging into, what is really free memory, what is on the zero list, the standby lists. We broke the spine on a couple of Mark Rusinovich Windows internals books, digging back and forth through what happened. And this, by the way, got even worse when you start getting into the managed code world. You have .NET applications, and all of a sudden you've got garbage collection stuff going on, and you've got Gen 1s and Gen 2s and Gen 3s, and you're trying to figure out, is this an expensive event? Is it not expensive? What's happening here? You can get into a lot of misleading discussions about this. So again, I think the best strategy is gather some data when you think you're in good shape and keep an eye on it, and don't make any assumptions about what you see. Because of the enormous amount of data that's gathered, it's pretty easy to say this system is just too busy. It just shouldn't be that busy. But modern OS architectures, that's what they do, right? There is a security issue. I alluded to this a little bit earlier. But because you are tracing in the kernel, the entire memory space and everything on that machine is available. So be careful with those log files. Some companies are regulated and have rules about whether or not you can bring data even to technical support with a vendor, because there might be potentially user information, right? We're in a tax and accounting world. If you're in the financial world, you've got a lot of information there. It's much like taking a full memory dump and giving it to a vendor. That might have someone's social security number, credit card numbers, all that kind of information there. So be very careful with that. Xperf will pop you up with a warning about that. I would not trade log files around like this to people that you don't have a relationship with. It's wonderful that people are willing to help in the say of Twitter and blogs and everything else, but be very careful with your memory dumps. Be very careful with your Xperf log files, because you just don't know what's in there. Anybody have any questions at this point? Yes.
On the slide, it briefly said that you can find a version for Windows 7, but is this new version backwards compatible with Windows 7?
So the question is, as I said earlier, you can find the version for Windows 7 available, but is this version backwards compatible? Yes. So the current Windows 8 version, 2008 R2, Windows 7, forward, fully supported. I kind of suspect, and I don't know this, I bet you're probably fine on Vista 2008 R1. There may be some functions that aren't implemented. Certainly from a data collection standpoint, I think you're fine. The analysis stuff, that may use something that is only available in those OSs, I don't know. But certainly from a data collection standpoint, you're fine there. I haven't tested it myself, but I'm willing to bet you that you could probably data collect still on XP 2003 and then just run your analysis on something later. There just will probably be some data that it was not gathered because that part of the kernel or something wasn't instrumented in this particular way, at that time.
In limited testing of the Windows 8 APK version of Xperf, it works fine on Windows 7. I haven't found anything that it doesn't collect, but documentation.
Right. So what the gentleman is saying is that in his limited testing, it does seem to work. But again, one of the problems with Xperf, right, is it gathers so much. How are you really going to notice something is missing unless it happens to be the exact thing that you're looking for? So again, your mileage may vary. I think it probably works. And it certainly, I think, works 90% plus of the functionality. So this is a high-level diagram I stole from Microsoft about the architecture of what we're talking about. So it's, I think, simpler than they sometimes make it out. You have producers, which are things that expose information. That can be the Windows OS internals itself. It could be code that your own developers have written that might have instrumented, whatever. There are controllers, and then there are consumers of the data. I kind of view controllers and consumers to be the same thing. The controller is something that tells you, start producing this data. And then the consumer is simply something that actually consumes that data. So from the app standpoint, the Windows Performance Recorder is something that fulfills the controller standpoint. It starts the traces, gathers the data. The consumer is the performance analyzer. And again, you can see these are these ETW traces that it consumes. So I simplified. There's two players involved as far as I'm concerned. There's a provider and a consumer. There's two different things you start. If you want to, again, write your own providers, that is available. You can certainly customize some command line arguments to start your own providers if you want to try and winnow away the massive amount of data that is gathered. So Windows Performance Recorder just enables those providers and collects the data. The Windows Performance Analyzer presents it to you. The raw log files, by the way, that are gathered by WPR are not readable or understandable in any way that I am aware of. Whatever that is, that's some sort of stuff in there that you can't make heads or tails out of without some sort of consumer that processes and looks at that stuff. The other interesting thing that it does is it also packages this stuff for portability. I'm not entirely sure how it knows this, but because you can move these trace files from one machine to another, when it writes out the trace file, it's smart enough to write anything that appears to be unique to that machine or environment inside the trace file so that it's portable. I'm not sure how it can know that, but that's what it says it does, and it appears to work, because I haven't ever had a problem opening something, even on a different generation of the OS, where, you know, obviously the binaries are going to be a little bit different. So however it does that, all I can say about that is I guess it's pretty cool. So what's new? You have less need for command lines like this. And again, there's no problems with command lines, but when you start adding this sort of stuff, it gets a little bit difficult. Even if you're fine with this, I mean, do you know if you need deferred procedure calls? Do you know if you need your interrupts? Pretty soon you're digging out a copy of Windows internals trying to figure out what this option does and whether or not it's going to be relevant to me. This is the old GUI. This was from the Windows 7 SDK, I believe. And I always thought one of the funniest things was this thing over here. I think the project manager in a Channel 9 video called those chevrons. And so these were little flyouts. And you would click on the stuff and menus would basically open out. And I can't recall ever seeing that kind of GUI in anything Microsoft had ever done before. And so it was kind of curious. You were like, okay, I have chevrons. And here, I'll show my geekness and age. You start talking about chevrons, I start thinking about a bad science fiction show. All right, so Stargate, for those of you who are a connoisseur of bad science fiction. The big time ring would go around and chevrons would engage, but anyway. So let's take a look at what we've got here. I'm going to go ahead and fire up Windows Performance Recorder and show you what we've got here. So it installs by default into a Windows Kits folder. Again, entirely obvious, right? That's where you would go looking for it. So this is the recorder dialog. So you have options here, and this Add Profiles button is what I talked about earlier. You can customize things so that if you want to try and window down the data that is gathered. It's doable. It doesn't look like the worst thing I've ever seen, but it's more complex than anything I've really wanted to deal with at this point. So that Profiles button just opens up those profiles. Here's one of the funnier things about this. There's a scenario analysis. So apparently Xperf was used really heavily in the multimedia development of the Windows. They were always trying to, you know, optimize things like audio glitches and all of that kind of stuff, video, that sort of thing. So if you open up the scenario analysis, you can see that they've got some predefined options for audio and video glitches, and even MiniFilter IO Activity. What's that sucker right there? So apparently Internet Explorer was glitchy enough and problematic enough that it got its own scenario right up there with the multimedia functions in Windows and with MiniFilter IO Activity. So yeah, I don't know what I can tell you about that other than go use Firefox or Chrome. The MiniFilter IO Activity, by the way, is pretty interesting. I think it's fair to say that over the years, a lot of mini-filters, particularly from people in the security industry, have been at the root of a lot of performance problems. I think everybody in this industry has run into a poorly behaved antivirus or security app that has had a noticeable impact upon the performance of your systems. So the ability to get into that MiniFilter IO activity is pretty interesting. And again, this is part of how deeply you're woven into the kernel of Windows with ETW. You have performance scenarios over here. You have general, which is certainly useful. You have boot, which is interesting. There used to be a separate tool called Boot Manager that was part of this package back in the Windows 7 and earlier. They have, as near as I can tell, just integrated that functionality into here under one GUI, so you don't have to use a separate tool. You've got shutdown stuff, your reboot cycle, standby, resume, and hibernation. Power management is apparently a hot topic with internally in Microsoft with Xperf. People are always interested in optimizing, I guess, battery life of the OSs and things like that. And from what some of their blog posts say, the improvement in battery life from like Windows 8 or even Windows 7 compared to XP, most of that benchmarking and work was done with Xperf as the tool for it. There is one other thing I wanted to show you here. So boot logging is kind of interesting because, you know, in general, what are things that we're interested in a lot in our world is login times and boot times. Watch your number of iterations there. It defaults to 3, which means it will run through 3 complete boot cycles. And that still has to package up that data and write that data out. So you can find yourself using up a lot of disk space as that runs. You can cancel out of it, but just be aware of what the default is, I think. This up here on the time and buffer and events dropped, I think is another interesting thing. I talked earlier about how ETW uses the circular logging, so you can in fact drop events which may be relevant to you. So it used to be pretty difficult to try and figure that stuff out. I mean, even with something like Process Monitor, you'd have to go through and look at sequence numbers and things like that and try and find any dropped events. Now at least it's smart enough to tell you that events have been dropped and what your buffer size is. Your detail level, verbose and light. Verbose is, as I think I've said about 4 times now, really verbose. You're going to get a lot of information. And you'll see, even when we do very short, like 10-second captures here a little bit later, you're generating a fair amount of data. I think the last time I did a boot log on this, well, I can go look. So this is a relatively clean laptop. That's the data size for a boot log trace, just one single one. And there's like, I think, a webcam utility and Skype that loads on boot up with this, and you know, the Intel ProSet wireless utility. So relatively clean, and you're already up at 850 megabytes. So imagine that if you've got other startup services or something like that running, they can get big in a real hurry. This, I think, has always been one of the more interesting features of Xperf in that you've got your logging mode. So by default, it goes to memory, because we talked about that earlier, right? You don't want to start analyzing disk I/O. You don't want to find out if you have a disk I/O problem at boot when you're writing 850 additional megabytes of log files out to your disk. That's certainly going to muddy the water on the analysis. So you can write to memory, which means RAM, right? Or if you don't particularly care, I mean, if you have another issue you're looking at, like it might be network or you know, whatever it might be, you can write that out to a file. And of course, then your files can get quite large. And any particular way you want to handle that is you know, up to you. It can be interesting just to play around with to see what happens in terms of the system itself. So the other part of the performance toolkit here is the analyzer. And the analyzer is graph happy. Let me just, I suppose it's probably easier just to open it on one of these other log files here. Let's take a look at this boot trace. And again, as you can see, there's some work involved in pulling in these traces.
While we're waiting for that to come in, quick question.
Sure.
In your experience, how well does Xperf help in a HyperV situation?
So that's interesting. So the question is how well does this work in a HyperV situation? And I guess I'll expand that out to any hypervisor. I don't have HyperV in my environment to test in production. So anytime you're working inside an OS that's hosted by a hypervisor, I would say you have the potential for distorted results. We certainly know from looking at standard perfmon counters that anything that was time-based can certainly be distorted, right? Anything that was on a millisecond basis, you know, the hypervisor is essentially time slicing underneath the VMs, right? So the clock data isn't going to be accurate there. I would say this is probably subject to some of the same limitations. What you can do, of course, is run Xperf at the host level if you want to try and figure out something there, and you should be accurate. I would still think that this is probably awfully useful information if you separate out the time basis. There's an inevitable amount of overhead there, right? But if you're profiling the system or if you're profiling an application, like we'll look at one a little bit later, that data, while there are certain potential inaccuracies out there, time-related, you can still get, I think, a lot of useful information, you know, about what the app is doing, you know, and even how long it takes if you're looking at different scenarios. You know, maybe one machine has got an issue and one doesn't. If you're inside the VM, I mean, you get into deep water pretty quickly on that stuff. But I would say you still have your usefulness here, but, you know, be aware of the caution and the caveat. Does that seem reasonable? Yeah.
At least any time smooth to happen with that, all of the graphs that you have up the same, so you're not like you're going to get things out of order.
Right, so Tim's point is a great one. So when we talk about the time and accuracy, we're talking about absolute time, but we're not talking about relative among the processes and things running on the machine. So things are unlikely to be out of sequence or out of order or anything like that. So what would you call it? A predictable, acceptable inaccuracy? You know, maybe potentially even an irrelevant inaccuracy, although I hesitate to go out there and say that. So again, yay, no chevrons here, right? You can add graphs to these analysis tabs just by a simple double click. So you've got your system activity by process, you've got computation, which is CPU, right? Storage, memory, and power. You can add these things and stack them on top of each other like this. And one of the interesting things about this is, I hope that shows up there on the screen well enough, you've got this vertical bar. So when you look at time slices, this will be consistent across these stacked graphs. So if you see something that is spiking, you can trace that back to the other part of the graph to see what particularly is going on. You'll also see a lot of hovering information, if I can get that to stick there. Hey, I'm absolutely shocked. It appears like an antivirus process is sitting at the top of one of my spikes of activity for CPU. Shocking to all of you, I am sure, right? But again, you can get the tooltip information, hovers over here and gives you some information. So you can see this gets interesting here. Like I can highlight a range like this and zoom in, expand this out. And it's consistent across all the graphs here, which I think is one of the really nice functions. You don't have to manually sync this up. It will do it for you on the fly, which can make the analysis much easier. As you can see, you've got a lot of data here. The GUI is fairly straightforward, right? You can unmark things, mark them, whatever you want. I think one of the nicest things about this is you can filter to a selection. So if this is what I want to see and I don't want to see everything else, I can knock that all out. So now I can kind of get rid of some of the extraneous noise in the system at this point. And of course, you can do tabs up here just like it's a browser. So if you want to put graphs or rearrange multiple graphs in different ways here, you can do that. So this is the graph stuff, but you also have interesting options on what you can do with graphs and tables, because graphs may hide information from you, right? So you also have these options here for a table, which actually gives you summation stuff. And at this point, you know, we're looking at, this is the trend micro antivirus. You can see the count number, the number of events, the weight of these things, and this scrolls over, you can get additional stuff. You can also add columns to this stuff. It's not all shown by default. So you can add stack module function stuff if you're really smart about knowing stacks and functions and that sort of thing. You know, addresses, thread IDs, all that kind of stuff. Again, I don't know that to those of us who are system administrators how relevant some of that information is going to be, but it's not a bad place to look at some things if you need them. Certainly things like thread IDs can be more interesting in terms of tracking a process. If you see this gold bar here, this kind of separates the information. This is basically stuff that is sortable. You can drag these columns over to the other side. And let's clear the filter here and get a bunch more information back. So now you can sort by count, the number of events. You can sort by thread ID, that sort of thing. One of the things I want to make you aware of, but I'm not really going to talk about, is there are stack options in Xperf. There's a stack walk command line parameter, and what that essentially means in many ways is you can try and get the actual stack information, provided you have things like symbols and PDBs. Microsoft has a public symbol server. We're getting off into territory I don't think we venture in too much, but if that is something that you work with, you can configure your symbol path just like you're working with WinDebug or LiveKD, something like that. and load your symbols. Again, the one caveat about that is if you've ever done that before, it's helpful to set up a local SIM cache and to allow some time, because fetching symbols, depending on what's going on in the system, might take a few minutes. So if that's something of interest to you and you don't see things immediately, give it a little bit of time. I've seen, depending on what you're looking at, symbol loads take, minutes, 5-10 minutes even, depending on what's going on in the system, what your connectivity is like, if you're trying to use the Hyatt Wi-Fi, that sort of situation. So you can see we've got quite a bit of data here, and what you choose to find is relevant to your particular situation is obviously going to vary. But again, we've got the zoom functions in here. You've got the hover over options. You can zoom the graph into a new group, into a new view. You can duplicate graphs, all that sort of thing. You can even select your time range if you want to do that by decimal rather than by dragging around the mouse, that sort of thing. Anybody have any questions at this point? By the way, feel free to interrupt. I'm going to try and leave some time for QA at the end of it, but if you have anything, feel free to ask your questions at any point. So in this boot trace process, essentially what we see here is that there really weren't any particular issues here because this laptop was relatively clean. In this situation, let's unzoom out. You can see the process lifespan on all of these things. Some of this is just more interesting to, I wouldn't say benchmark, but monitor over time. Things like your WinLogon and where that enters in, the different processes. This can all help with slow boot times. One of the things I have not had a chance to explore with, which I'm really interested to try and see, is what you can do in a provisioned environment with this sort of thing, where you're streaming the OS down. I'm not sure what that's really going to look like in that process, but I have been told by people that it works and will provide useful data. So that might be something that we could be talking about next year. So this is relatively straightforward here. I'm going to go ahead and exit out of this, and we'll try and tempt the live demo gods here by doing something live. So if we bring up the performance recorder, I'm going to go ahead and leave CPU, disk, and file I/O marked. General performance settings, we'll leave it at verbose, and we might as well log to memory because I want to show you what happens up here in terms of time and everything. So we'll go ahead and start the trace, and then I'm going to go ahead and fire up something. Let's go find Skype. That doesn't take long. Okay. So you can see here what's our buffer size, the time that's running, and events haven't dropped because this isn't a busy system. So we can go ahead and save that log file out. And as you can see, again, what did we spent maybe 5 seconds or something launching Skype. It still takes time to package up that data and write it out. And again, some of this, I think, is the packaging that is done on the trace file to make it portable.
And some of it is that it's still tracing.
Right. Which is the thing I was going to show you right here, right? You see this? We've saved out that trace file. Oh, you might have assumed that we have stopped the trace. We have not. We are still actively logging at this point. Now, I'm sorry, Claudio, did you?
Yeah, just one question. Well, here I can see it's a system-wide capture.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just trying to think in terms of the admin troubleshooting.
Right. So you're talking in terms of the admin troubleshooting. You're probably talking a lot of user mode code, right?
No, what I mean is, for example, boots is usually not the main issue that you're gonna get into, but login times,
Mm-hmm.
definitely.
Right.
So here, if it's a system-wide capture, I go on the TS as administrator, I run it, I capture, I analyze.
So what I would tell you in that context is there's a great, I think it's a 4-part blog post from the PFE team about their methodology for using Xperf to troubleshoot slow logins, slow boot, slow logins. They call it SBSL, I think, in the blog titles. And they kind of step you through what they think is the best way to do it. I will say that, though, even having looked at that, there's still a lot there. I mean, everything I've ever done with Xperf means that I've got a lot of noise around it. the best thing about it is its power and its detail. The worst thing about it is its power and its detail. And that's why I wanted to put that note up on the slide that says this is not the first performance troubleshooting tool I would use. But we lost the user environment debugging option when we went to Windows 2008. They removed that. So it's been kind of difficult, I think, to troubleshoot slow logons, since then. Have you used anything else to troubleshoot stuff like that, Claudio?
Other stuff, but I'm just trying to understand from here, if it's an RDS system, that's fine.
Right.
We can find our way through the, whatever it creates or how it gathers. But if I'm doing VI, am I going to tell the user to log on and run this?
No, what I would probably doing would be you'd be running this capture yourself while they do the logins, just like I did this capture with Skype, and then you're going to try and figure out what's going on. If we get lucky with a trace here, we'll see some options that might give us a hint of what's going on.
But where I run it to, that's the question.
Where do you save the data to?
Connecting to a VM, I have to run the tool on the VM itself.
Right.
If they are connected to the VM, they have the session on the VM. So I can't connect to the same VM and run the tool. So the user himself has to run the tool, right?
Yeah, I see your point there. I mean, you could try and run it on the system level, but you're right. You would probably be running that inside their VM. So, again, that's something where you could probably make use of the command line facility to just do like a batch file or something like that that would start up or hook into the process as they do things. But yeah, I think the VDI case, at least as I understand what you're saying, Claudio, this is probably a difficult tool to use for that scenario.
Yeah, I'm just trying to remember, because I think I tried at one point, and I remember for the logon process itself, you had to fire up and then log off. And then it would run in background, and then you would log on, it would capture, and it would stop.
Right, you can certainly do that right. It'll persist past the log off, right. Because at this point, as to Tim's point, this was still running. And actually, there was a rather humorous, one of the best sources from a guy who blogs out there for Xperf, works for Valve, the game company. Yeah, go ahead.
PS execute command line sets it up, user doesn't even know it.
That makes good sense, right? Use one of the sysinternals PS execute tool to execute it inside another session.
Primarily use this for virtual desktop environments and tricky.
Oh, perfect.
Really?
So just PSSX, the user doesn't see or anything.
Yeah, if it's in command line mode, then.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if I got that. So the point is here to troubleshoot different sessions or VDI issues, you can combine this with PSX so that you don't have to be in that session to start thing. You can use that to start within other sessions and grab the data. So to get back to what I was saying, one of the people who does the most blogging about Xperf is a game developer for Valve. And he actually leaves Xperf running on his development machine all the time. Because of the circular logging function, he just has it just rotates through the buffer, right? He's not concerned about the overhead on that on his machine because he's got, some sort of, dual socket hex core 32 gig machine or something like that. So if he's devoting, a few hundred megabytes of memory to the circular logging, he doesn't care. And so at that point, whenever he actually experiences the problem, he just flips over here to the performance recorder and saves off the log at that point. And within that log, theoretically, should be the information to whatever hiccup he just experienced. I'm not going to even suggest to you that you should do that on anything other than your own machine for fun. If you do that on a production system, God be with you, all right? I mean, theoretically, it should be okay, at least from what this guy is saying, but I don't have the guts to do that. If you're in a bad place and you have an intermittent problem that you can't constantly or consistently reproduce, that might be a strategy that you could look at, but I just can't find it in myself to suggest to you that you do that in any real way. It just seems way too dangerous. So let's make Skype go away. And here we've got our trace. And as you can see here, just starting that up, we've got about, what was that, 5, not even 10 seconds, I don't think. That's still a non-trivial amount of data, I think, here. And see, here's an interesting thing that it popped up for you here. This is one of the closest things I guess I would say that Xperf does in terms of any guidance. In system activity, it has a UI delay here when we're monitoring a process. So you can zoom in on this. Expand this out. And again, we've got, this consistency on the line across both of these graphs so that you can come in here and take a look at what particularly is going on. So we had something going on with SVC host, which, great, right? What's one of the most annoying things to troubleshoot in Windows? SVC host, because there's multiple processes inside of it. So that's not going to be intuitively obvious to me at that point for what's going on. But you do get some suggestions here about what particularly is happening. And again, if you're interested, I think sometimes what we've used this for, perhaps with questionable accuracy, but we have used this before, is monitoring things like process startup for different versions of applications. How many of you guys saw Jerome's virtual reality check session where he talked about Office 2013, or have heard of it? A few of you. So I'm kind of really fascinated to see what we might be able to pull out of that, because the last time I talked to Jerome, he knew that we had this resource utilization issue, but he wasn't entirely sure what was going on. And he may not be able to determine that, or I suppose being who they are, it's possible they're under an NDA with Microsoft or something and can't talk about what's going on. But it would be interesting to compare 2013 to 2010 and see if there's something we could determine on what's going on the resource utilization end of things. I wanted to talk a little bit about some other options. I think one of the more interesting options is you have a couple of options for CPU gathering. There is a sampling and a precise option. So sampling samples every millisecond. Pretty straightforward, right? But obviously what happens within a millisecond on modern machines can be a lot. So you can potentially miss something. There are options available to sample precise, which actually fires an interrupt, and it's an interrupt at the top of the stack that preempts all other interrupts, as I understand it, that will that'll fire off every time there's a context switch. And if you've ever worked on a terminal server or a Citrix box, we know there are a lot of context switches on a multi-user box, right? So I've never worked with that much in depth, but I would be careful there. If we think we're generating large log files now, if we're generating log files on every single context switch on a production multi-user box, I don't know what you'd run up with. I think you better be real sure about your storage that you've got. And again, you can do some options about redirecting these log files. But if you do that, particularly across a network, you're going to have a really healthy network and really fast I/O on those shares, or you're going to run into the problem where buffer information is dropped. And saying that, I've worked with traces that have had dropped information in buffers, and they're perfectly valid, and I was still able to find things. You just have to be aware of the fact you're not seeing everything. Sometimes what's going on is so blatantly obvious that even if there's a lot of dropped information in the buffer, you can see what's happening. We had an issue with Trend Micro earlier in the year that was just generating enormous amounts of I/O on our Citrix servers. We would go and look at Task Manager at the end of the day, and we would see the I/O activity for Trend was north of 400 gigabytes of read I/O activity on a box. And these were provision server boxes, right? So you'd go and look in the provisioning server, little option down in the system tray, and it would say there was only 20 gigs of data streamed to this box, and I have 400 gigs of read I/O going through this. So in that case, we were gathering traces both with Proxmon and we tried it with Xperf. And it dropped a heck of a lot, but it was really obvious what was happening. And we got in some back and forth with Trend, and eventually we were able to supply them with some options, and there were some changes that we were able to make. And I think they actually released a hot fix to address it without actually telling us. But those are the kind of things that even though you don't have complete buffer data, you can still get a lot of good information out of the trace. Okay, anybody have any questions? All right, at this point, I think I'm going to go ahead and shut it down. I'll be here for any Q&A you might have or any experiences that you're willing to share. Tim?